Good morning. Welcome to our conversation, Can We Call It Canada? I'm Heather Nicol, Director of the School for the Study of Canada, and I've got four other colleagues and friends joining me today to talk about this issue. Mike Classens, School of the Environment, Trent University. Sarah Cullingham, School of the Environment, Trent University. Momin Rahman, Chair Sociology at Trent University. And J.F. Arteau, Kasserwan Arteau legal firm in Quebec, who's had tremendous experience dealing with Aboriginal law, Indigenous and Northern issues. So to begin our discussion, Can We Call It Canada? Thinking about what that entails, particularly in the last couple of months, this is a very timely issue. It's certainly an issue we've been dealing with for a long time. It's not a new issue, but every once in a while, we have a new iteration of the discussion because the problem never goes away. So I want to turn to Mike, and who is really the person who had the inspiration to formulate the discussion today. And I'm going to ask him to explain, in a sense, why we're here, what triggered this conversation in this sort of day and month and particular time, and then to explain a little bit more about his concept of Canada, how he deals with the category of Canada in his work, whether there are risks entailed, what are the challenges of not using the category of Canada, what are the challenges of using that category. So Mike, I'm going to ask you to start.
Great. Thanks, Heather, and thanks as well for to everyone else for being here. This question sort of came up. So I'm on the editorial collective of Canadian Food Studies. I'm also the vice president of the Canadian Association of Food Studies. And at our AGM about a month ago, this question came up sort of in the context of a general discussion, partially about how we were going to sort of respond to the current sort of socio, political and cultural moment that we're all living in. To kind of struggle with this idea of what does it mean to sort of present Canada and Canadian in the title of these organizations kind of unproblematically? And who might we be erasing within the context of using these words? And so really, I reached out to Heather asking for some resources of sort of, things that I might want to read or sort of consider as we think about these things within the context of these organizations. Assuming that these conversations had happened, in the School for the Study of Canada and the Canadian Studies programs, and she very generously assembled this panel of experts, and I must say it's a real privilege and honor to have access to this kind of network, through Heather, to assemble this kind of discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. My own kind of limited, understanding of this question or framing of it is going back to Ian McKay's 2000 article in the Canadian Historical Review, where he sort of argues that Canada needs to be considered, an ontological category in and of itself, and within that context, an ongoing project of liberal rule. And I think he makes a compelling argument that we can't just see Canada as a vacant lot, as he calls it. And I'm quoting here, one more brackets, relatively minor, unbracket, place where class, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on interact as they do everywhere else on the planet, end quote. So I tend to agree with this framing that there is something maybe distinct about Canada as an ontological category, and potentially we do ourselves a disservice if we don't sort of consider that in our work, in our teaching, in our advocacy work. I know that I felt, often frustrated that if I'm looking for scholarship on a particular, area in my field, very often it's American scholarship that sort of comes to the foreground. And I do mostly sort of community-based work. And so I think that those differences matter, not only within the context of, say, Canada, but also even at the community level. So if I'm doing work in Peterborough, there's not that much work research done on Peterborough. So I do see the usefulness of thinking about Canada as, again, a kind of ontological category, some kind of administrative, legal kind of thing that that matters in some way. But I also understand, though, that there is a sort of cultural and political and social critique that we can make of Canada and the state, you know, as a sort of state, and that obviously Canada means very different things to many different people, and people experience Canada in very different ways. Indeed, for many people, Canada, even just hearing it might, you know, be, you know, triggering in some ways, you know, because people have had a very, in many cases, historically violent kind of relationship with Canada. So again, this is all kind of messy. I'm really here to sort of learn and listen, and, you know, try to kind of sort through this. So again, I feel very lucky to be part of this discussion today.
Okay, super. Thank you, Mike. I'm just really interested in what you said, and of course the way that we framed the whole discussion in the first place, and the reference back to McKay's article, because at first I thought that where I should go is go and talk to the historians, and then I realized that this isn't particularly a historical problem. It's a slightly different problem than that. And I, like you, see Canada sort of as in terms of an ontological framework. And in struggling with the idea of why I don't think this is a historical problem, I want to come around perhaps the end and just talk a little bit more about, it's really a question of redefining, I think, how we think about what the role of the state is, not necessarily how the state has acted in the past, but what the role of the state is now and how it's changing. And you know, it goes to the way I think a little bit about the fact that we often talk about, and rightly so, you know, Canada is a colonial project, or Canada, and it is, or Canada is a product, in McKay's article, you know, product of sort of liberal, you know, liberalism and liberal forces, and it is, and other people talk about it as a product of globalization and neoliberalism, you know, and it is. But all of that isn't necessarily conflicting, because Canada is certainly in a state of change. And the state itself, whether it's Canada or any other state, is never static over time. The state adapts and changes through history, through time. And I think that perhaps in kind of moving away just from the historical argument, I want to sort of bring to the forefront some of the discussions some of my colleagues have had. I'm a political geographer. We do border studies. So the concept of border in relation to the state really speaks to the issue of what the state is. And you know, scholars are sort of, particularly border scholars, are really talking about sort of the state as something, entanglement, you know, entanglement of discourses, processes, structures, institutions. There's path dependencies here. You know, clearly what the colonial state did not go away in 1867, in fact was reinvented, a new colonialism was reinvented, did not go away in 1967, has not necessarily gone away now. But on the other hand, some of the processes, a lot of the processes and the way those paths and threads of colonialism interact are changing. And so I think we have to understand the state more as a sort of a bundle of different processes, some of them very much being reinforced and structured in the present, and some of them, you know, bringing along and dragging along behind them sort of all kinds of baggage and historical historical traditions and historical ways of doing things. But that doesn't mean that this is necessarily a historical process, right? I think that that's where we keep getting caught up, thinking of this as a historical process. It's really that bad fit between the myth of Westphalia, you know, that the nation state, that there never was a nation state. I think the idea is that there might be one in Iceland these days, because it is the only country in the world where there is one so far, one sort of people fairly recently settled there in one territory. So we keep banging our heads and tripping up over this notion of the model of what we think about the state doesn't work. And then of course that model of what we think about the state is based on the idea that we think the state is historically, again, that word, the state has been the only legitimate, really the definition, the legitimate source of violence, the only actor that has the legitimate right to use force or coercion on, on a group of people. That is what the state is. That's what legitimates it within a specific territory. So now, and I hope, JF, you're probably going to talk to this, and I think some of Momin, I think some of the others are going to talk to this. Now, though, we're really rethinking our concept of what sovereignty is, what the role of the state is. And we see this exploding in recent years in terms of the legitimacy of different actors, right? There's the subnational, national, supranational, transnational. There are people out there, that go to the UN that represent groups of people who are not, government, are not state actors. They're groups of people within nations. They're not part of nations necessarily, but they're let's say the nation that they come from, they can be transnational. So this notion of what sovereignty is, and now we'll probably come back to this, Mike, I know you sometimes talk about food sovereignty, right? And when we in general, we talk about things like food sovereignty, or we talk about indigenous sovereignty. And we use those concepts fairly unproblematically now in the larger world. So how does that fit? I think the problem that Canada is going through right now isn't unique. And I think that when we come back and talk a little bit more, I mean, the big problem with can we work outside the category of Canada, how imperfect it is sure we can, but who are we going to work with? So it's got to be sort of a multi-pronged discourse and evolution, but over with the world itself. So it's not something, we can't solve the problem of the whole by solving all the problems of the past. It's not a problem of the past. I guess that's my argument. The past is important, but it's not about statues. It's not about words as much as trying to create structures that fit, get the round pegs in the round holes. And I'm going to leave it at that and turn to my colleague, Sarah Cullingham, who's always got such great things to say.
Echo what Michael said and say, I'm really happy for the invitation to participate in this conversation, and excited to hear the different perspectives that everyone brings. I'm maybe a bit nervous too. I'm obviously at a different stage of my academic journey, being just a first-year PhD student in Canadian Studies at Trent. So I don't have the same depth of experience maybe as some of the others on the panel, but hopefully my perspective as someone who's kind of newly coming into the academic sphere and wrestling with how to think about these terms and setting off on a research project will, have something to add to the conversation in and of itself. And I do want to acknowledge that I am speaking here from Nogajiwanong, Peterborough, the place at the end of the rapids, the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga-Anishinaabe. As a settler on these lands, I'm truly grateful for and to our Indigenous leaders and the First Peoples for their ongoing care and teaching about our earth and our relations. I hope to honor that relationship and these teachings in my work and what I have to share today. And with that said, I think I'll just say that I do often use the term Canada to describe my work, especially when I'm doing the kind of boilerplate language of just a simple explanation of what I do. I think I did this most recently in an email to Momin, where I talk about how I study Canadian drug policy or the legalization of cannabis in Canada. So in that sense, I think I'm often using it in that more administrative category sort of a way to denote a jurisdiction, which I'm much more comfortable with, I think, than its more cultural or symbolic readings and interpretations. But even that idea, I think, starts to fall down at even kind of a superficial level. So, for instance, when I'm talking about Canadian drug policy, we can think about how we've had federal exemptions for supervised injection services for a number of years, but we still don't have these life-saving services available here in Peterborough, despite having, a poison drug supply. Similarly, with cannabis legalization, we obviously have the Federal Cannabis Act, that framework, but how that's being rolled out across the provinces is really different. And that gets even more complicated when you consider how different Indigenous nations are asserting control and authority over the cannabis industry in their territories. So I don't think that those examples really destabilize necessarily the concept of Canada, but I think it does call into question its usefulness, right? Like, can I really say that I'm studying Canadian drug policy or even cannabis legalization in Canada, given all of the difference and nuance that's packed into that term? So for myself, I do expect my language to evolve over the course of my studies. I think I'm kind of starting out from this point of falling back on the term Canada, and I expect that I'll get more specific as I move forward. But I do think that it kind of speaks to the risks of using the term, in that it can hide a lot more than it describes, right? And often for me, I think what I think about is what it hides in terms of the difference of lived experience. So again, like, I study cannabis legalization or drug policy. So I could make a statement like, cannabis is now legal in Canada, but what that means to me as a white middle class woman who now has access to recreational cannabis fairly easily is really different than what it means for someone who might have been working or is working in the legacy market and has been left out of transitioning to the legal market. Or for people living in the downtown east side in Vancouver or other places who face structural barriers to accessing legal cannabis, even though they might be using it for therapeutic purposes, although maybe not kind of medically sanctioned, right? So there's all of that experience that's obscured when I start to use Canada as kind of a catch-all, even in that more administrative or jurisdictional sense. And those omissions obviously aren't kind of accidental. They're often, you know, falling along those structural lines of race, class, and gender. That said, I do think, you know, there is the reality of the government of Canada and the Canadian state as it currently exists. That means we can't totally get rid of the category. But I do think it's important to be kind of cautious and specific when we use it. And then that can be a really important kind of intervention, both in terms of kind of pointing to those differences of experience and making it really clear the kind of constructed and contested nature of that category, right? So not taking it as a kind of a pre-given, but really giving that space to have those conversations and to unpack it. Because it, you know, it doesn't exist outside of our engagement with it. Like, I think, you know, we can all acknowledge the Canadian state, like it has been built up, it can be rebuilt or dismantled. And those are important things to remember, I think, especially right now in our current time. So I don't know that I think that the specific terms are what's most important in terms of thinking about alternatives, because I think the terms will be plural and really context specific, but more so being able to engage in those conversations and to do that work of unpacking both the historic baggage, you know, and the current kind of realities that are embedded and kind of obscured by our use of the term. So yeah, I think that it's in those conversations. Obviously, we can think about it in a geography sense, like we can invoke different place names, or we can look at different cartographies of space, but we'll have to have different conversations in different disciplines. And it is in those conversations that we can start kind of imagining alternatives, not just in terms of the terms, but also in terms of our process and relationship. And I think that's what's most important and exciting for me in having these kinds of conversations.
Super. Thank you, Sarah. That was such a great articulation of some of the issues that we face. And I want to next turn to Momin to carry the conversation forward.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Heather. So I think Heather said that I'm a prof in sociology here at Trent. I am, perhaps you can tell from my accent, that I'm an immigrant, and I come from the old colonial country of the UK.
And forgive me, Momin, you're also a prof in the School for the Study of Canada now, but that's very...
That's true. And I want to talk a bit about sort of the state as the kind of controller of those kinds of movements. And One of the interesting things and important things, I think, for Canadian society and public policy is that, immigration is a huge component of what's going on every year in Canada. I think the numbers are around about 300,000 a year. Last year, a Council of Economic Advisors to the government suggested that they double that number because of Canada's aging population and low fertility. And that was rejected, I think, by all of the major political parties. But that's been a massive transformation in Canadian society over the last 30 to 40 years. There's evidence from Statistics Canada that, in Toronto, which is the largest city, over 50% of Toronto will be, first-generation immigrants within, 20 years. So there are always transformations going on in the society. And at the moment, the state apparatus, the federal state apparatus controls that. It has the ability to set those policies. And my engagement with that process of immigration has been completely through that administrative or state apparatus, and they control everything, right? They set the criteria. You have to submit your documentation to them. And even, I was lucky in that I had a job, but you have to have either a high level of skills or a job. So Canada is very much about economic immigration. It bases its decision to let people in on their contribution to the economy. So although it's a great immigrant nation and will continue to be so, it's fundamentally about sustaining the economic life of Canada. That's had some consequences. That's had some very important cultural consequences in that we see lots of different ethnic cultures. And what I want to talk about here is the fact that, we have a state, which is a kind of administrative, historically formed entity. But in that state, within that geographical boundary, are different groups of people. And they usually have they've traditionally had some, version of a national ethnic identity. And ethnicity here, I'm thinking in terms of a combination of biological descent, but mostly, and more importantly, cultural practices. And so we now like to think of Canada as a multicultural nation. And what that means is that we have a variety of different ethnic groupings here, increasingly from South Asia, but also traditionally people from Britain like me, although of course I'm South Asian heritage, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But we already have cultural differences within Canada, and I think that's one of the things that we're really focused on here. And perhaps they haven't been as visibilized or as respected, and particularly here for Indigenous First Nations people. But also we have a big cultural difference in French-speaking peoples here, predominantly in Quebec, but also New Brunswick, and we have French language minorities, so French cultural minorities across the country. So it's always been interesting for me as an outsider to think that you have this kind of massive influx of various different ethnicities over the course of official Canadian history, right, since Confederation, but increasingly turning towards racialized minorities. But on the other side, if you like, internally, there's always been that difference, but it's about whether that difference has been kind of recognized, whether it's been legitimized. And of course, we've seen that, particularly for Indigenous peoples, there was basically an attempt at sort of cultural genocide and legal administrative control through settler colonialism. But also, we've seen a kind of resurgence over the last 40 years of, the understanding that Quebec is a nation. And so we have this mix, right? We have this mix of different challenges to the idea of what we might think of as a shared or a unified national identity. And I think that's maybe where a lot of these concerns come across. Perhaps we're not really saying, okay, we're going to get rid of the nation state, because we kind of, we live in a world of nation states and interstate action, even at places like the UN. And that controls a lot of resources. It controls the ability to come here to get a job. It controls resources when you're here to get a job, or when you're here trying to get a job or trying to survive. But what is more, I think, up for contestation and is a positive thing is that, I think, going through a process of abandoning the idea of a unified national culture. And particularly, I think at the first step, the notion that that would be a kind of Anglo-defined culture, but also that that would now be just a European defined culture. And in the period that I've been here for the last 13 years, there's been this huge raise in public consciousness because I think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and specific educational programs in particular, you know, where I see coming through school and universities to address that kind of invisibilization of knowledge and delegitimization. So that, I think, I think that creates a cultural moment in which it makes us more open to the idea that not only do we have to account colonize, but also think about, broadly speaking, what kind of cultural and material reparations or restitutions we might make. But that inevitably means we have to reflect upon the fact that there are also different cultures that are coming in through immigration, through economic migration, and have been here for you know, quite a long time. And so that it feels like there's a good moment here for us to be reflecting upon what we see as Canadian identity, and whether that becomes pluralized or whether that becomes completely destabilized is perhaps one of the, maybe the concerns for more traditional people, but also perhaps one of the opportunities for us. I just want to end on the fact that I'm from the UK, but my family are from Bangladesh originally, so I'm Bangladeshi heritage, although I was born and raised in the UK. And in the time that I've been in Canada, one of the kind of things that has been slightly horrific to watch is the UK going through its decision to leave the European Union, which is, you know, the world's biggest conglomeration of national states that operate together as a market and as a travel zone. And then more recently, the kind of protests against Britain's role in colonialism, and again, you know, particularly against statues of slave traders. In my hometown of Bristol was one of the first statues that was toppled. And I think that the culture in Britain is such that I think it's been very difficult for that dominant culture to be open to change and transformation. You know, Britain is as multicultural a country as Canada. It has always had sub-national, you know, national groupings, the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh. But there's been this really dominant version of what a British culture is. And that has really excluded cultural, linguistic, and ethnic differences. And I think that's part of the problem you see going on in Britain now, is that there's no public discourse around, you know, reformulating the idea of Britain from this kind of glory days, as the people see it, of empire and white supremacy, towards a multi-ethnic, globally connected national culture. And I feel that we're probably in a better position to do that. And I think that perhaps my sense is that we're in a better position to do that precisely because of the turn towards reckoning with the colonial settler history of Canada and the rise in Indigenous politics related to the TRC. And I think that's actually created a positive moment for everybody else who lives here to think about the variety of differences here. So I'll just end on that, I think, and pass over to Jean-François.
Thank you, Momin. And Jean-François, we'll turn to you for words of wisdom.
Well, thank you. Sure, yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's a real privilege to share some ideas with you and hear from others, of course, about what Canada is, and should we call it Canada? Actually, it's a very, very good question. It's an excellent question. As you said, Heather, I'm a lawyer by trade. I work as a lawyer on an everyday basis. I work mainly with First Nations, but also with Inuit throughout the Canadian Arctic. But I'm also a graduate student of philosophy from Columbia University in New York. And I like to think that law could be an answer sometimes, but not all the times. And to have a philosophical approach, I think would solve a lot more problems than law would do. This is just between ourselves, of course. So can we call it Canada? Again, it's a very good question. When I'm preparing for this panel, I was thinking to myself, do we often use the word Canada in our relationships with the First Nations, with Inuit, and in my regular work? And curiously, the answer is no. actually we tend to refer to Canada as being the federal government. So automatically we refer to Canada as being a governmental structure, some sort of a state, of not so much in terms of identity, but more in terms of what it is. It's a different structure. It's the other, in other words. It's something that is not us. It's not part of our identity from a First Nations perspective. It's somebody else, somebody who colonized them for sure, and it would give them some subsidies over the years. Of course, we had some very important reports saying that this is a bad relationship that was created between Canada, if you want to call it Canada, or the federal government and the First Nations and the Inuit as well. But it's also, like I said, the other. So we're always pushing against Canada or trying to get something from Canada in a very bad father and son relationship. And I think there's not so much to gain from this bizarre relationship that was established a long, long time ago. Because when we think about it, where does Canada come from? Well, it comes from 1534, when Jacques Cartier arrived here in Quebec City, actually, where I am, from Saint-Malo. And he was told that Kanata, come with us to Kanata. Kanata meaning village. It's one of the meanings of Canada, of course. And Kanata was a Huron name for village, for where we can find dwellings and community organizations of some sort. So this is where it's coming from. It's coming from the First Nations, actually. And now Canada is kind of distinguishing itself from the First Nations as saying, well, they're part of Canada. Yes, they were here before us. But at the same time, we have this strange feeling of not being entirely included in our modern Canada, as we like to call it. I'm not sure if it's that modern, by the way, but that's another question. So where and how do these First Nations groups and Inuit fit into our actual Canada? It's a very good question, actually. I'm not even sure that they do fit, because they think they used to say that they were first Canadians, Canadian first. You probably all remember the slogan that was a few years ago, but they don't say that anymore. Actually, quite curiously, the Inuit tend to see it more and more that they're Canadian first, and then they're first Canadians. And well, First Nations, they don't say that anymore. And we do refer to Canada when we get to think about that, and not in terms of the federal government, as I was mentioning before, but really in terms of Canada, when we're on international platforms or international forums, when we go to the United Nations and we say this about Canada, and there, of course, we do refer to Canada as being a state, a country, but sometimes more to question what they're doing and to make the world know that they're not doing what they're supposed to do with the First Nations and with the Inuit. So it's more to criticize our country, Canada, than to be, than trying to be part of it, actually. So, and one of the questions I had, and I think I'm going to stop here for the moment, but one of the questions I had, and I think we will have some minutes to share among us with that is it that important that we are all included in Canada, or is it not for us to build our own meaning of Canada, in other words? So is it possible for First Nations and for Inuit? Of course, I'm from this perspective. Is it possible, and should it be allowed, that they themselves build and define what Canada should be for them, and what kind of Canada could be included in? So that's a question I had, and I'm going to stand here for now.
Thank you, Jean-François. Does somebody want to, does that raise any particular questions or comments? Does anybody want to jump in at this particular point?
I have a question for Jean-François in terms of something that happened a few years ago, I think in Ecuador, where they decided to allow Indigenous peoples to have their own identity documents that were, constructed by the local Indigenous groups. And I think that counted as an identity document also internationally. I may be wrong about this, but I think, so effectively it allowed Indigenous people to have their own passports, saying that they were a member of, this Indigenous nation in Ecuador rather than the state of Ecuador. And I just wondered what you thought about that, because I thought, well, are we inevitably caught up in these structures of you know, a state or some authority saying you belong, right? Like you belong to this authority, right? This state. Does that, and I don't know like, is that negative? Because within Canada, there's a bad history of identity documentation, right? Like for Indigenous people. So I just try and think about how would we live as a variety of different nations together? How would that work? Who would get to decide?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Thanks for asking. I think it's a matter of self-determination, actually, and that's it's a concept. It's still a concept because it's quite difficult to crystallize what self-determination is exactly once you're within a given country, such as Canada. So what you're referring to is very important in terms of identity documents, but unfortunately, the Inuit had a very bad experience with that, with what we call E8 numbers. Maybe you all know that they were given, each of them, because apparently their name were too complicated to pronounce, so they were given numbers. E8 for Eastern 8, that's in Nunavik, E7 for Nunavut. So they were given numbers and really a badge that they were wearing with them all the time, just to make sure that they were properly identified. So, but this idea of passport, Indigenous passport, and I'd like to go back to the term Indigenous. This idea of Indigenous passport, I think, is a good one, because that would reflect how they see themselves, and it would also tell the world that they're not Canadian, they're not maybe only Canadian, but there's something else. And this is really important to make the world know, in other words, that they are I don't know, Huron, Algonquin, Inuit, or so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And just a few words on the terms Indigenous or Aboriginals, as we used to call them. It's kind of strange that they're not using this term themselves. They don't define themselves as being Aboriginal or Indigenous. They would tell you, I'm a Huron from this specific community. I'm the Nook from Iqaluit, for instance, or from Kasserwan, or from Nuuk. So they see themselves not so much as being Aboriginal, being different, actually, but they see themselves as being part of a given community, and in many instances, apart from a very small community, as small as possible, I would say. So they're from this specific village. They wouldn't tell you, I'm from Nunavut. They would tell you, I'm from Joe Evan, I'm from Baker Lake, I'm from Rankin Inlet. So that goes to show that this idea of identity is probably something close to small is beautiful. And maybe this is something that we can reflect upon.
You know, that makes me think, I describe myself, I think, as South Asian when I was talking, and that's kind of the term that is used to encapsulate a whole range of people. And my family and my culture never describe themselves as South Asian. Everybody says they're Bengali, Bangladeshi, and 30 years ago, we all described ourselves as Indian, even though there was actually, a different state at that point. But traditionally, it was all India. So, yeah, it's funny that, but that's we always have to work from inside the grouping to translate. We always use terms to translate to people outside of us, and maybe those terms need to be contested. And that, to some extent, is what happens with the use of Canada, right? Like we're using that to signal to people to translate who we are, where we're from.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, it's interesting. I did a book on, Canada. I did a book on Canada-U.S. border, Canada-U.S. relations, and I find it interesting because we have this desire. Did we lose JF? I think we might have he might have dropped off. Whoops. Anyhow, we have this desire to, in a sense, create an identity for Canada. Way back, it was like a weather front. Canada was just seen as some kind of a foggy mass that, France and Britain kind of said, well, we don't know where the borders are, but there's our interests. And, trying to fill this space with, sort of a Euro-Canadian identity at the cost of all, after American identity and push out all other identities. It's been a really, really fascinating process. But, I wonder if we're not, it's sort of something crazy out of the blue, but we're sort of married to these notions that identity has to be some intense feeling of, I belong to a group of people based on, I'll take up my sword and go kill them in the name of my king and people. And that just is such a foreign concept. Identity is just such it's a slippery slope. And I just quickly to speak to something you said, Jean-François, and it reminded me of Michael's comments that when we were looking at renaming, when we were looking at the School for Study of Canada, and also looking at naming our CRC chair, which is the study of the Canadian North. In both cases, Canadian Studies was put forward as a name. And we shifted it to the study of, because I think Canadian Studies and Northern, let's see, what was it? The Canadian North. The proposal was the study of Northern Canada, all imply some kind of identity. And really, if you there are ways to get around that notion that certain kinds of identities are pre-givens, and that you have to subscribe to that identity. I mean, we really are. I mean, that to me, that's part of the problem. We really are kind of a work in progress, and the notion of not having one specific identity is probably more normal, particularly for the 21st century, than not. And I kind of worry a little bit in Canada that we look at where we are now and the evolution of, I think, things that are working well in the terms of searching for new identities, searching for new structures, searching for being more open, searching for changing that notion of sovereignty that I was talking about. And we somehow think that that's problematic because it's not clear, right? But anyway, I think identity is important, but I think you're right about identities are much more localized than I think of myself as somebody from my little place in Canada. I don't think of myself as from the big map, and I don't know that I'm that unusual. But anyway, I'll stop there. I might actually ask Mike a question also, because that when we've talked before and you've talked about, I think when we talked about food security, and then we talk about issues like food sovereignty, and how does that notion of the relationship, I guess, of a group of people to the state that isn't based on ethnicity, isn't based on background, isn't based on a shared history as much as an economic situation or a convergence of economic activity. How does sovereignty fit that definition?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the themes I think that's kind of emerging here is this idea of, I guess, sort of plurality. And, in the same way that maybe a decade ago or so, we sort of shifted our language around talking about, politics, and as a way sort of reinforcing the point that there isn't just kind of one politic, but there's a number of sort of competing or complementary sort of ongoing politics. I think that maybe thinking about food sovereignties is maybe a useful way to think about this, because one of the sort of principles of food sovereignty is that it is a sort of group of people, loosely defined maybe, who have control over their food system. And similarly, I think a lot of people talk about food systems these days, not just one sort of totalizing food system. And so I think that to think about food sovereignty in the context of any kind of meaningful application of it, I think you need to start small. Small is beautiful, as Jean-François said, and I think but eventually still you do, I think, confront the state, the federal government, because agricultural policy is significantly obviously determined by the federal government. You know, we have a long history of export-oriented, sort of cash crop-focused system, which regulates all kinds of agricultural activity at the federal level. There are, of course, some sort of provincial jurisdictions with respect to agriculture, and in fact, even some sort of regional and municipal county level intersections with agriculture as well in terms of land use zoning, etc. So, so the possibility, I guess, of say a food sovereign Peterborough or a food sovereign Curve Lake or food sovereign Hiawatha is, I think, significantly complicated by the kind of you know, administrative reality of the sort of cascading levels of government. I think that this, you know, this is obviously particularly problematic in terms of, say, Hiawatha and Curve Lake, and I reference those because, of course, we have a shared administrative relationship, I guess, with those two First Nations in particular, because they are within the legal sort of geographic boundary of Peterborough County. But I think this idea of food sovereignty is particularly problematic with, obviously, within the context of the First Nations, because there, you know, of course, is a very much different kind of historical legacy and ongoing sort of relationship with the colonial government that Peterborough doesn't necessarily have. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very complicated question, but I think, again, one of the things that seems to be emerging for me is that pluralizing these things is maybe a useful, at least conceptual maneuver to sort of think about this idea of difference and locality and sort of small scale, etc. At least as a sort of conceptual or kind of analytic move. Doesn't necessarily remove, though, of course, the administrative reality of these sort of cascading levels of state control.
Can I just jump in and then ask Jean-François? So if we think of that kind of as one definition of sovereignty, how does that compare with say the kinds of ideas about Indigenous sovereignty that we've seen emerging through UNDRIP and also through the ICC's statement on sovereignty? Do you see worlds apart here, or do you see any similarities in this concept of sort of?
No, I do see some similarities, of course. Yeah, but everything is, I mean, each self-determination process, I guess, is different from one to the other. That's quite understandable, as you say. But it's strange to note that this reviving of self-determination concept was done first on an international platform from UNDRIP, as you mentioned, which Canada has still not ratified, by the way. No, it's not ratified. No, they talked a lot about that, but it's not ratified, and it's not, as we say, integrated in our law system in Canada. Yeah, so it makes things even more difficult, because when we negotiate, just to give you an idea, what we call impact and benefit agreements with a mining company, for instance, and there was just one big agreement just finalized a couple of days ago in Nunavut with Mary River Project, for the second phase of Mary River Project, a project over $1 billion. When we negotiate with them, it's quite difficult to make them understand that they actually need consent from the Inuit or from the First Nation, because they're impacted first, of course, yes, but also because they need to have a say in this project. Do they really want to have this project happening on their territory or not? So self-determination, it could vary from this low level of participation into a mining project, for instance, as far as going to have our own court system, our own laws. Child protection is a good example of that. Canada just came out with a new national bill on child protection, youth protection. And each province, and I'm telling you, Heather, it's a real problem. Each province has its own views about youth protection, of course, but it should allow First Nations and Inuit to determine themselves what kind of sets of rules they want to have in terms of youth protection for their own community. And even that, it varies a lot from one village to another. So self-determination, maybe just as much as identity, should be considered as on a very small scale perspective. what is self-determination, not for Nunavut, but for Iqaluit, for instance, which is totally different than Rankin Inlet, of course, which is different than Baker Lake, a very small community. Well, in Nunavik, it's the same. If you talk about Kuujjuaq with almost 3,000 people, of course, it's going to be very much different than Apaluk with 200 people. So self-determination has to be, I think, general enough and flexible enough to adapt to the reality of these nations and communities. Otherwise, it would be worthless.
Great. Have we got any other questions or comments that? Momin, yeah.
I was one. Sarah, did you want to jump in? You looked as though you were moving to your mic. I'm going to let you jump in if you want to. No? No, I'm going to let you go first. Go. I've spoken already.
I think the thing that was coming to my mind is just the focus on the localization, and especially, you know, hearing Jean-François, you talk about processes of asserting self-determination. Like, I think that perspective is also so important because it allows us to see that upward pressure, right? About how people really are making change and able to have those conversations that assert influence on, you know, the overriding federal government structure, or those sorts of things that are really important to be able to see, because otherwise we can get, I think we can overemphasize, and I don't want to totally diminish, but I think we can overemphasize the kind of downward pressure of that administrative structure too, which doesn't allow us to see those really creative and generative practices that are happening at the really small scale, sometimes not so small, but definitely localized scales. Yeah.
Can I jump in, Heather? This is going slightly onto a different topic, but it's something actually, Heather, you said about, you know, we see the identity isn't as important, or, you know, a certain definition of identity or an assumed identity. But I speaking as a sociologist, I want to say that we shouldn't either hope to or actually try to dismiss people's ethnic identifications or groupings. Like, it, you know, it's pretty obvious that anthropologically, historically, sociologically, people do you know, define themselves, you know, in relationship usually to cultural practices like religion, for example, but also it has been historically to do with like locality. That isn't the case anymore as much, but it can be used in a negative way by a state authority or by other dominant ethnic groupings, for sure. But I don't think the point is that we see that as problematic in and of itself. I think it's more about this idea that Michael was mentioning, and Jean-François has said, about, you know, recognizing the self-determination rights of a particular ethnic grouping, but also recognizing the pluralism. You know, if decolonizing a concept like Canada, particularly in relationship to a title of a journal, where the journal has to be findable, right? Searchable and translatable. People need to know what that journal is about. So we use this term, but maybe what we're doing, or going through a process of contesting what that term means. So when somebody reads that, they don't think, oh, this is, you know, Anglo-European descended culture anymore. This is this post-national or multinational, multi-ethnic state, you know, that there's indigenous sovereignty with passports, that's what people think of when they actually read that word. And that's a process of re-signifying a concept. And I think it's a long-term process, but I feel that we're sort of, you know, in the middle of that now. And the problem is, working for the national union that I do in Canada, it's called the Canadian Association of University Teachers. Now, everything official we do is translated into French. We don't often do translations into you know, indigenous languages. We have an indigenous working group that does sometimes do that, but it's a problem, right? In terms of when we think about what do we call ourselves, and we've talked about this, like, is Canadian a great term? But there isn't a good alternative, because we're talking about institutions that operate, you know, in these lands and are subject to some of the same resource distribution, right, from federal funding councils, and some similar resource provision through provincial education funding. And so there's not a good alternative that would actually ironically include everybody, even though we kind of think, traditionally it's an excluding term, right? Like it's a colonizing term. But I don't know that we have a better inclusive term. So I wonder if what we're aiming to do is to re-signify what, Canada means. And it's only through, I think, social movements and the kind of contesting of that, and sometimes transforming some aspects of sovereignty. So like, the federal government isn't the only person that issues passports. Indigenous communities gets to do that, right? That changes the nature of what it means. Some of you will know that I do work in international LGBT politics, and one of the interesting things, I sometimes work with the Canadian, federal government, and they have changed their description of, when they're at the UN or they're at the Commonwealth and talking about LGBT rights, they now include 2S, right? And that's come from, absolutely has come from, Indigenous movements. One of the ironies is that they will include that, but they won't necessarily have taken on board that means that there's a different way to conceptualize sex and gender from the Euro-descended way, which is LG, and apply that when they're talking to other cultures globally. So there's still a conceptual leap to be made in terms of, okay, as Canadians, we'll use 2S as well as LGBT, but we haven't yet realized, okay, well, that means that there might be differences globally too. So it's a process. I think, I'm pretty sure they're going to get there, but it's a process for sure.
It's interesting looking back, 20 years ago from the article, Mike, that triggered your thinking about this. And I gather at the time, the idea that Canada was an ontological concept or category was quite groundbreaking or quite remarkable, or certainly within historians who are debating it, it brought up strong emotions and different understandings of history and fostered, interdiscipline kind of wars. But, when we look back 20 years later, I think that the notion that, as Momin was saying, we've all been saying kind of the notion that we can think of Canada as some kind of one thing, one category, that it's not ontological is a no-brainer. And I mean, that's why when I say it's not a historical problem, I don't mean that there's no history. I mean that, this question of understanding the process where we are now, as all of you have been talking about today, and understanding the complexity and finding, I think there's been a failure of imagination in the past that I think, we can start overcoming now. I know working, and perhaps I'll just wind up with this, saying that working with some colleagues looking at the Jay Treaty in Canada, for example, people would have said 10 years ago, oh, you can't talk about it. The Canadian government's not interested in that. And Jack, you probably know this too, that whole notion is gaining some traction. Just like I remember 10 or 12 years ago standing up, I was actually in Montreal, saying, what's your problem with Indigenous sovereignty? And then somebody said, well, you're talking about taking you take different people from different communities on an international tour. And I thought, well, what's the problem with that? And now that's pretty normative. So I think this is a challenge. Momin, you're talking about social movements, and activism is important, and understanding differences, and I also think, our imagination is also important. Maybe that's but then whose imagination? So I guess some ways we come back full circle. But I want to thank you all, and ask, is there anybody who'd like to say anything? I don't want to cut the discussion off.
Maybe, if you allow me, Heather, maybe just a few words, because when you mentioned one Canada, one roof, and one everything, it made me think about, remember a few years ago when the American government was in charge of the Arctic Council. When they had the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, they had to choose a team for their chairmanship, and it was so badly chosen that it was One North. Of course, there isn't such a thing. That doesn't exist. One North, unless you think North is American. So in other words, they meant our north, but there's no such a thing. There's no one north. There's multiple norths, and for the better. I think the more ways we have, the more differences we have, the more flexibility we do have, and to allow everybody to be able to cope with that, to deal with that, it's just great. So maybe at the end, Canada is a geographical location, and in fact, nothing more than that. It would be all right. It would be sufficient. It would be for us to fill up this geographical location with our views, with our thinking, with our differences, with our point of views and different perspectives. And maybe this is just the way it is now in 2020. Who knows, in 2040, maybe we can all be wrong. But for this time, I think it'd be a good path to walk on.
Well, my barking dog.
I just want to,
yeah.
Heather, I just want to riff off something Jean-François said. However we contest Canada, I wonder if a next panel might be about the fact that we'll all still continue to agree that we're superiorly, smugly better than the US, because that seems to be an important part of defining Canadian national identity. And I say that in a humorous way, but that's actually a really economically, materially important part of what we might decide this land is and how it exists, right? Like there's always this notion that we're doing better than them, and I think at the moment it's horrific because in terms of the pandemic, and we look to, we have friends and family down there, and we think, okay, they're really not doing well. But we're any definition or any ongoing discussion of Canada at some point is going to have to be like, well, how do we manage this relationship with the world's most economically and politically powerful country that is always interested in resource extraction? Yeah, particularly in the north.
That's a great idea. Are you guys game? Will we just meet in a couple of days and do that one? That's very, very true. Very true. Well, thank you so much, all of you. I just so appreciate the conversation we've had today, and it's an important question, and let's see what comes of it. But I want to thank you all.
Thank you
for organizing, Heather.
Yeah, that was great.
Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Yeah, thank you very much.